Hello. Once upon a time in a quiet, small town, there lived a 75-year-old woman named Edith. Though age had taken its toll on her body, her heart still held onto the spark of youthful desires. She lived alone in her old house, which had been passed down through generations. Her children had moved away, and her once vibrant life had become mundane and solitary. One evening, Edith's car broke down. She needed it fixed, but she wasn't particularly interested in driving. She saw it as an opportunity to bring someone into her lonely world, a chance for company. So, she called a young mechanic named Tom, who was well known in the town for his skill and friendly nature. Tom arrived the next day, a polite, hard-working man in his early 30s. Edith watched him closely as he worked, intrigued by his youth and energy. As he fixed the car, she began chatting with him, offering him lemonade and snacks, doing her best to be charming. Tom, ever polite, accepted her hospitality but remained professional. He fixed the car, thanked her, and went on his way. For the next 6 months, Edith couldn't stop thinking about Tom. He had awakened something in her, a longing she hadn't felt in decades. But no matter how hard she tried, she knew there was no natural way for a 75-year-old woman to catch the attention of a man half her age. But Edith was not one to give up easily. She had lived through enough hardship to know that sometimes, unconventional methods were needed to get what one wanted. So, she reached out to an old friend, a woman who was known to dabble in charms and the occult. This friend put her in touch with a local prophet, a man who was said to have mystical powers. A plan was hatched. Several weeks later, Tom came back to Edith's house for another job. This time, he brought his friend, Mike, who often helped him with larger repairs. As the two men worked on the car, the prophet arrived, seemingly out of the blue. Mike greeted the prophet like an old friend, introducing him to Tom as someone who could bless their work and help bring good fortune. Tom, skeptical but curious, didn't object. The prophet went inside with Edith, and there, in the dimly lit living room, he performed a strange ritual. He spoke in low tones, chanting words that made Edith's heart race. She had told him exactly what she wanted, that Tom would see her not as an old woman, but as a young, beautiful woman of 21, full of life and allure. The prophet promised her it would work, but there was one catch. Once Tom was under the spell, he would never want to leave her side. Later that evening, after the car was fixed, Tom came into the house to wash up. When he looked at Edith, something had changed. His eyes widened as if seeing her for the first time. She wasn't the frail old woman who had called him for car repairs. In his eyes, she was stunning, vibrant, and youthful. Edith, now confident, played along with his enchanted vision. From that day forward, Tom never returned home. He stayed with Edith, utterly devoted to her. His friends and family grew concerned, searching for him, but they could never understand why he suddenly vanished from their lives. They couldn't comprehend why he would choose to live with an old woman in a decaying house on the outskirts of town. But Tom, under the spell, believed he was living with the love of his life, a beautiful young woman who made him feel alive in ways he had never experienced before. The townspeople whispered about Edith's strange new relationship, but no one could explain it. In time, people stopped asking questions. Tom became a ghost to those who had once known him, and Edith, despite her age, felt a kind of happiness and fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. As the days turned into months, the prophet's words echoed in Edith's mind. Tom would never leave her side. But what Edith hadn't anticipated was the weight of this everlasting attachment. She began to realize that while the charm had brought her the companionship she so desperately craved, it had also trapped her in a web of deception and guilt. For Tom, life had become an illusion, and for Edith, the lines between reality and fantasy blurred more with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, Edith's once vibrant sense of satisfaction began to sour. What had started as an intoxicating love spell had become a twisted, nightmarish prison, both for her and for Tom. His constant presence, his unwavering devotion, was no longer flattering. It was unnerving. Wherever she went, Tom was there, staring at her with eyes full of obsession. He was like a puppet, unable to think or act beyond his fixation on her. Edith, now physically appearing in her 20s, often stared at her reflection in disbelief. Her skin was taut, glowing, her body, once frail and bent with age, was now supple and full of energy. But something felt wrong. No matter how youthful she looked, she couldn't shake the deep sense of hollowness growing inside her. Her body was young, but her soul was still heavy with the weight of her years, her choices, and her guilt. She tried to push the dark thoughts aside, focusing instead on Tom, who seemed blissfully unaware of the strange transformation their lives had taken. But the more Edith tried to accept her new reality, the more restless she became. It wasn't just Tom's devotion that unnerved her now, it was the look in his eyes. There was something off, something vacant. His love for her wasn't natural. It wasn't real. It was like staring into the eyes of a man whose very essence had been drained, leaving behind only a shell of a person. One evening, Edith sat at the kitchen table, staring into her cup of tea, feeling the walls of the house closing in on her. Tom, as always, was sitting across from her, gazing at her with that same blank adoration. "Tom," she said softly, trying to find some way to reach through the fog of enchantment. "Don't you miss your old life? Don't you miss your family, your friends?" Tom blinked, confused, as though the concept of his former life was foreign to him. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Edith," he said in a low, almost robotic tone. Determined to fix things, Edith sought out Prophet Samuel. She tracked him down to a small, crumbling house on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed to mirror the darkness that had taken root in her life. When she confronted him, pleading for a way to break the spell, Samuel only smiled, his eyes gleaming with a sinister satisfaction. "Break the spell?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "I warned you, Edith. You wanted him to love you, and now he does, eternally. You asked for your youth back, and now you have it. But the universe always demands balance. The spell cannot be undone without cost." "What cost?" Edith demanded, her voice trembling. "I'll do anything." Samuel's smile widened, and he leaned in closer. "The cost, Edith, is his life." Edith recoiled in horror. She had never imagined it would come to this. She wanted Tom to be free, but not at the expense of his life. "There must be another way," she whispered, her voice shaking with desperation. The prophet shook his head slowly. "Once bound, the only release is death. The longer the spell holds, the more it drains from him. You've already noticed, haven't you? He's not the same man he was. His mind, his spirit, they are slipping away. The spell is consuming him, just as it's consuming you. That's the balance." Edith stood there, frozen, as the weight of Samuel's words sank in. The price for her selfishness was too high, and now, no matter what she did, there would be no happy ending. She had taken away Tom's life in every meaningful sense. His body was alive, but his spirit was fading. She left the prophet's house, the wind biting at her skin, but it couldn't cut through the deep sense of dread that filled her. When she returned home, Tom was there, waiting, as always. His face lit up when he saw her, and he wrapped his arms around her in a desperate embrace. But as Edith looked into his eyes, she saw it, the emptiness. His gaze was dull, vacant, his soul eroding like sand slipping through fingers. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but the thought of ending his life, of taking away the little that remained, was too much for her to bear. For days, Edith wrestled with the decision. She considered running away, leaving Tom behind, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. He was bound to her, and he would follow her wherever she went. The only way to free him was to end the spell. One night, as Tom slept beside her, Edith stood over him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. Tears welled in her eyes. He had no idea what she had done to him, no idea that his love for her was nothing more than a twisted illusion. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, whispering, "I'm sorry." In the dead of night, Edith called Samuel one last time, pleading for mercy. He arrived, his shadow long and menacing in the moonlight. "Are you ready to pay the price?" he asked, with a heavy heart. Edith nodded. "Do it." Samuel pulled out a small vial filled with a dark, shimmering liquid and handed it to her. "This will break the bond. It will free him, but it will take his life. Are you sure you want this?" Edith looked down at the vial, her hands trembling. She knew there was no other choice. Tom would never be free if she didn't let him go. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure." The prophet turned and left without another word. Edith sat beside Tom, her heart breaking, as she poured the contents of their vial into a glass of water. She lifted it to his lips, gently coaxing him to drink. As Tom swallowed, his eyes flickered open, and for the first time in months, she saw a flicker of the man he used to be. His gaze cleared, if only for a moment, and he looked at her with recognition, not as the young woman he had been enchanted to love, but as Edith, the woman he had unknowingly been trapped with. Edith, he whispered, his voice weak. What's happening? Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his head in her hands. I'm so sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry. Within moments, Tom's breathing slowed, and his body went still. Edith sat there, holding him, as the spell finally broke. The silence that followed was deafening. She had freed him, but the price had been too high. And as the first light of dawn crept through their window, Edith felt the weight of her choices settle on her shoulders, knowing that she would live with the consequences for the rest of her life. The youth that had been restored to her felt like a curse now, a constant reminder of the life she had stolen and the man she had lost forever. Thank you for watching, and be prayerful out there.